A chance encounter. The streets of Brookwood bustled with their usual chaotic rhythm. Cars honked impatiently at intersections, street vendors called out their offerings, and the hum of life echoed between the towering gray buildings. Among the throngs of people, a young boy named Caleb weaved through the crowd, his backpack slung low on his back, its weight pulling him slightly to one side. The pack was old, the seams frayed, and Caleb's sneakers slapped against the pavement with a rhythm born of urgency and weariness. At 15, Caleb had learned that life wasn't going to hand him any favors. His mom, Linda, worked long shifts at the diner down the street, her hands perpetually smelling of coffee and cleaning chemicals. His younger sister, Mia, only 8, was often left in his care, a task he accepted without complaint, though it weighed heavily on his shoulders. The family lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the neighborhood. It was barely large enough for 3, but Caleb knew they were lucky to even have that much. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and the thin envelope Linda had hidden behind a cereal box in the cabinet was still depressingly light. Caleb's mind swirled with thoughts of how he could help ease the burden. He had just come from school, where he had spent most of the day staring blankly at his books, the math problems blurring together into a confusing mess. As he walked, Caleb's stomach growled. The peanut butter sandwich he had scarfed down during lunch seemed like ages ago. He passed the corner grocery store, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting out, teasing him. But there was no time to stop. Mia was waiting for him back at the apartment, and he needed to help her with her schoolwork before he headed to his part-time job at Mr. Patel's bodega. The crowd thinned as Caleb reached the stairs leading down to the subway station. The air shifted, growing cooler as he descended into the underground. The distant rumble of an approaching train reverberated through the tiled walls. Caleb was halfway down when he noticed an older man struggling with a suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. The man was hunched over, his thin frame bent under the weight of a large, battered suitcase. He looked to be in his 70s, his face lined with age and effort. His glasses sat crookedly on his nose, and he wore a worn gray coat, its edges fraying. He gripped the suitcase handle with both hands, pulling it up one step at a time, his movements slow and laborious. Caleb paused. He could keep walking, pretend he hadn't noticed. He was tired, and the last thing he wanted was to haul someone else's belongings. But something about the man's struggle made him stop. Maybe it was the way the other commuters brushed past him without a glance or the faint desperation in his eyes. Caleb sighed, adjusting his backpack before descending the last few steps. "Hey, sir," Caleb called out, his voice steady but kind. "Need a hand with that?" The man looked up, surprise flickering across his face before softening into a grateful smile. "Oh, bless you, son," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I didn't think I'd make it up these stairs on my own." Caleb nodded, stepping forward to take hold of the suitcase. The handle was cool against his palm, and when he lifted, the weight nearly pulled him off balance. "What's in here?" Caleb asked, laughing lightly. "Rocks." The old man chuckled. "Just a lifetime of memories." Together, they climbed the stairs. Caleb's muscles burned with each step, the suitcase heavier than he'd expected. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. The man followed close behind, his hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder for balance. When they finally reached the top, Caleb set the suitcase down with a heavy exhale. "There you go," he said, standing upright and rolling his shoulders. The man leaned on his cane, catching his breath. "You've got a strong heart, young man. Not many would have stopped to help an old fool like me." "It's no problem," Caleb replied, brushing off the compliment. "You going far?" "Just to the next street. My daughter lives nearby," the man said, smiling faintly. "She worries when I take the subway, but I like to feel independent, you know." Caleb nodded. He didn't really know, but he understood wanting to carry your own weight. "Well, I should get going. My sister's waiting for me." Before Caleb could turn to leave, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Take this." "What's this for?" Caleb asked, hesitating before taking the paper. "Just a little something in case you ever need help," the man said, his voice serious now. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who always put others first." Caleb unfolded the paper, his brow furrowing. It was a business card, simple and unassuming, with a name, phone number, and address printed neatly in the center. Edward Harlan, independent consultant. "I don't know what to say," Caleb said, looking up at the man. "Say you'll keep it safe," Edward replied with a wink, "and maybe give me a call one day. You never know when paths might cross again." Caleb nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. "Thanks, Mr. Harlan." "Call me Edward," the man said with a smile, picking up his suitcase. "And thank you, Caleb." "How do you know my name?" Caleb asked, startled. Edward chuckled softly. "I have my ways. Take care, boy." And with that, the man disappeared into the crowd, his cane tapping softly against the pavement as he walked away. Caleb stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the pocket where he had tucked the card. Then, shaking his head, he turned and made his way home, the weight of the encounter lingering in his thoughts. What Caleb didn't realize was that this small act of kindness would set into motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The unexpected visit. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Caleb's bedroom, pulling him reluctantly from sleep. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as his mom moved around in the kitchen. Caleb rubbed his eyes, still feeling the weight of exhaustion from the previous day. He had barely had time to think about the old man, Edward, before collapsing into bed. "Caleb." His mom's voice broke through the haze of his grogginess. "You're going to be late for school." "I'm up, Ma." Caleb called back, his voice hoarse. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, stretching as his feet touched the cold, uneven floor. He glanced at the small dresser in the corner where his backpack leaned, Edward's card still tucked safely in the side pocket. The encounter had been strange, almost surreal, but Caleb shrugged it off as one of those moments that meant nothing in the long run. He got dressed quickly, pulling on a faded hoodie and jeans, and made his way to the kitchen. His mom was at the stove, flipping pancakes, her dark hair tied back in a messy bun. The lines of exhaustion on her face seemed deeper today, and Caleb felt a pang of guilt for not being able to do more. Mia sat at the small table, swinging her legs under her chair as she doodled on the back of an old piece of homework. "Morning, sleepyhead," she chirped, her smile bright despite the early hour. "Morning, squirt," Caleb replied, ruffling her hair as he passed. He grabbed a plate from the counter and loaded it with pancakes. "Ma, you working a double today?" Linda nodded, not looking up from the stove. "Yeah, need to pick up the hours. Tips have been lousy this week." Caleb wanted to tell her to rest, to stop pushing herself so hard, but he knew it was useless. His mom was as stubborn as they came, and she wouldn't stop until she had no other choice. Instead, he ate in silence, the tension in the room almost palpable. After breakfast, Caleb walked Mia to school before heading to his own. The day passed in a blur of lectures, assignments, and the monotonous rhythm of a life that felt too heavy for a 15-year-old. By the time the last bell rang, Caleb's thoughts were already on his evening shift at the bodega. He needed to make every dollar count. Later that day, Caleb stood behind the counter at Mr. Patel's, scanning items for a line of customers. The store was cramped and dimly lit, the shelves packed with everything from canned goods to cleaning supplies. Caleb had been working there for almost a year, and though the pay was meager, it was something. As he bagged groceries for Mrs. Lacey, the elderly woman who always seemed to have a kind word for everyone, Caleb's mind wandered to Edward. He had almost forgotten about the business card until now. Pulling it out during a lull in customers, he studied it more closely. Edward Harlan, independent consultant. The address was in a part of town Caleb rarely ventured into, a place where the buildings were cleaner, the sidewalks wider, and the air somehow felt lighter. Caleb frowned. What kind of consultant needed a heavy suitcase and rode the subway? The thought tugged at the edges of his curiosity, but he brushed it aside. It wasn't his business. The bell above the door jingled, snapping Caleb back to the present. He looked up, expecting another familiar face from the neighborhood, but instead he froze. Edward Harlan stood in the doorway, his worn coat buttoned neatly, his cane tapping lightly against the tiled floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Edward's face broke into a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "Caleb," he said, his voice as steady as Caleb remembered. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Caleb blinked, glancing around the store. No, not at all. What are you doing here?" Edward walked slowly to the counter, leaning on his cane as he approached. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how you were doing." "In the neighborhood?" Caleb repeated, skeptical. He couldn't imagine what would bring Edward to this part of town, let alone to Mr. Patel's store. Edward chuckled, as if sensing Caleb's doubt. "Well, truth be told, I wanted to thank you properly for helping me yesterday. I wasn't sure how else to find you, so I asked around a bit." "You asked around?" Caleb's brow furrowed. "Why?" Edward's expression grew serious. "Because I see something in you, Caleb. Something rare. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." Before Caleb could respond, Mr. Patel emerged from the back room, his brows knitting together as he spotted Edward. "Everything okay here, Caleb?" Yeah," Caleb said quickly. "This is, a friend." Mr. Patel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "All right. Just keep an eye on the counter." Edward waited until Mr. Patel disappeared before turning back to Caleb. "I don't want to take up too much of your time," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the counter. "But I wanted to give you this." Caleb stared at the envelope, hesitant to pick it up. "What is it?" "Just a token of my appreciation," Edward replied. "Open it later, when you're home." Caleb nodded, his curiosity piqued, but he didn't open it right away. "Thanks, I guess." Edward smiled again, but there was a weight behind his gaze, as if he wanted to say more but chose not to. "Take care of yourself, Caleb, and don't lose that card." With that, Edward turned and walked out of the store, his cane tapping softly as he went. Caleb watched him go, the envelope in his hand feeling heavier than it should. What had he just gotten himself into? That evening, Caleb sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment, the envelope still unopened in front of him. Mia was in their shared room, drawing quietly, and Linda was in the shower, trying to wash away the stress of her double shift. The room was dimly lit, the single overhead bulb casting a pale yellow glow. Caleb finally tore open the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a crisp, handwritten note and a smaller envelope. The note read, "Caleb, thank you for your kindness. People like you are rare, and I want to help you find the opportunities you deserve. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me. Enclosed is a little something to help in the meantime. With gratitude, Edward Harlan." Caleb frowned, unfolding the smaller envelope. His breath caught as a stack of bills slid out, crisp, clean, and far more money than he had ever seen at once. He quickly counted it, $500. His heart raced. Why would Edward give him this much money? What did he expect in return? "Caleb." Linda's voice startled him, and he quickly shoved the money back into the envelope. "What's that?" "Nothing," Caleb said quickly, slipping the envelope into his pocket. He forced a smile. "Just a note from someone I helped yesterday." Linda gave him a suspicious look but didn't press further. "Well, don't stay up too late. You've got school tomorrow." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know what Edward wanted from him, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary act of gratitude. Something bigger was at play, and Caleb had a feeling his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Strings attached. Caleb couldn't sleep. The envelope, now tucked safely under his mattress, seemed to radiate an energy of its own, pulling at his thoughts. The $500 felt like a lifeline, a ticket out of the crushing weight of overdue bills and grocery lists, scribbled with too many crossed-out items. But it also felt dangerous, like accepting it had tied an invisible string to Edward Harlan. And strings had a way of tightening. He tossed and turned, the faint sounds of the city filtering through the window. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed. Caleb groaned, finally throwing off the blanket and sitting up. The small room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of a street lamp outside. Mia snored softly in the other bed, her small body curled into a tight ball under the thin blanket. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What did Edward want? No one just handed out $500 without expecting something in return. And why had he gone out of his way to track Caleb down? His mind flashed back to the man's kind yet serious eyes, the way he had said, "You remind me of someone I knew." The business card was still in his backpack. Caleb pulled it out, studying it under the faint light. Edward Harlan, independent consultant. The address seemed etched into his mind now, and his fingers hovered over the numbers printed below it. Should he call? Would it be better to ignore it? Caleb shook his head, sliding the card back into the pocket. He couldn't make this decision now, not with his thoughts tangled like this. He lay back down, staring at the cracked ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled him under. The next day at school, Caleb was distracted. His teachers' voices became a blur of monotone lectures, the words slipping past him like water. At lunch, his best friend, Malik, noticed. "You good, man?" Malik asked, sliding his tray across the cafeteria table. His plate was loaded with fries, half of which were already disappearing into his mouth. "Yeah," Caleb said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't. Malik raised an eyebrow. "Come on, dude. I know that face. Something's eating at you." Caleb hesitated. Malik was the one person he trusted, the one person who wouldn't twist things or judge him. But how could he explain something as bizarre as this? Finally, he sighed. "I met this guy yesterday. Old dude. He kinda gave me some money." Malik blinked, lowering his fry mid-bite. "Gave you money? How much we talkin'?" Caleb lowered his voice. 500. 500. Malik choked, nearly spraying the table with bits of potato. "What's the catch? Ain't no way someone just hands out that kind of cash." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Caleb muttered, leaning closer. "He said it was for helping him with his suitcase, but now he's showing up at my job end. I don't know, man. It feels weird." Malik frowned, his usual lightheartedness replaced with a rare seriousness. "You sure he's not some scammer, or, I don't know, part of some weird cult?" Caleb snorted despite himself. "A cult? Really?" "Hey, I'm just saying," Malik said, shrugging. "Stuff like this doesn't happen to regular people. If it were me, I'd take the money and run. But you," he pointed a fry at Caleb, "you're too nice. Bet you're already thinking about calling him." Caleb didn't answer, which was answer enough. By the time Caleb clocked in at the bodega that evening, his nerves were frayed. Mr. Patel was in a particularly sour mood, grumbling about a miscalculation in the inventory order. Caleb kept his head down, stocking shelves and sweeping aisles, doing his best to avoid conversation. The bell over the door jingled, and Caleb's heart jumped. He half expected Edward to walk in again, his cane tapping against the floor. But it was just Mrs. Lacey, her familiar shuffle easing some of Caleb's tension. Still, the thought of another visit made his stomach twist. As the evening dragged on, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A few customers came and went, but none of them lingered, and Caleb told himself he was just being paranoid. Still, every time the bell chimed, he found himself glancing toward the door, his heart pounding. By the time he closed up shop and locked the doors, the streets were quiet, the air cool against his skin. He started the walk home, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight of the envelope under his mattress, heavier in his thoughts than it had ever been in his hands. When Caleb got home, the apartment was dark. Linda had left a note on the table, her handwriting hurried and slanted. Double shift again. Mia's already asleep. There's food in the fridge. Caleb sighed, setting his backpack down and heading to the kitchen. The fridge hummed softly, and when he opened it, the light illuminated a half-empty carton of milk and a plastic container of leftover spaghetti. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he grabbed a glass of water and sat at the table, his mind turning over the same questions again and again. Why him? What did Edward want? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine? The quiet was broken by a soft knock at the door. Caleb froze, his pulse quickening. No one knocked on their door this late, not in this neighborhood. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a figure in the dim hallway. For a moment, his stomach twisted in fear. But then he recognized the familiar silhouette. Edward. Caleb hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. He opened the door just enough to meet the old man's gaze. "What are you doing here?" Edward's smile was faint, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to startle you, Caleb, but I needed to see you." "At this hour?" Caleb asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Edward nodded. "I won't stay long. May I come in?" Caleb hesitated, glancing back toward Mia's room. Finally, he stepped aside, letting Edward into the small apartment. The old man looked around, his gaze soft but discerning, taking in the cramped living room and the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen counter. "This is a good place," Edward said, his voice low. "Small, but full of heart. I can see that." "What do you want?" Caleb asked, crossing his arms. Edward turned to face him, his expression serious. "I came to make you an offer. A real one." Caleb frowned. "What kind of offer?" Edward reached into his coat, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. He handed it to Caleb, who hesitated before unfolding it. His eyes scanned the document, his brow furrowing. "This is a job application?" Caleb asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Yes," Edward said, his tone calm but firm. "I run a business, Caleb. A small operation, but one that could use someone like you. Someone hardworking, trustworthy, and eager to learn." "But why me?" Caleb pressed, his voice rising slightly. "You don't even know me." Edward smiled faintly. "I know enough. I've been where you are, Caleb. Young, hungry, trying to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. Someone gave me a chance once, and it changed my life. I want to do the same for you." Caleb looked down at the paper again, his thoughts a whirlwind. The application was simple, almost too simple, but the promise it held was both alluring and terrifying. "I don't know," Caleb said finally. It feels too good to be true." Edward stepped closer, his eyes steady. "I won't pressure you, Caleb. But opportunities like this don't come often. Think about it. And if you're ready, call me." With that, Edward turned and walked to the door. He paused, looking back at Caleb. "The world is full of locked doors, Caleb. Sometimes all you need is the right key." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. A key in the lock. The folded job application lay on the table the next morning, its corners slightly curled from Caleb's restless handling. He hadn't slept much. Edward's words echoed in his head, pulling at him in ways he didn't fully understand. "The world is full of locked doors, Caleb. Sometimes all you need is the right key." The offer felt surreal. Opportunities didn't just show up on Caleb's doorstep, not in his world, where every break had to be fought for tooth and nail. But Edward hadn't seemed like the type to mess around. His gaze had been steady, his tone sincere. Still, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something Edward wasn't saying. The smell of coffee pulled Caleb from his thoughts. Linda stood by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumping under the weight of yet another double shift. Mia sat at the table, her legs swinging under her chair as she scribbled on a piece of paper. "Morning," Caleb mumbled, pulling out a chair. Linda turned, giving him a tired smile. "Morning, honey. You okay? You look like you didn't sleep." "Yeah, I'm fine," Caleb lied, glancing at the application. He debated telling her about Edward's offer, but decided against it. She had enough on her plate without worrying about whether her son was about to walk into a scam, or something worse. "What's that?" Linda asked, nodding toward the paper. "Just something from school," Caleb said quickly, shoving it into his backpack. He didn't like lying to her, but he wasn't ready for the conversation yet. Linda raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Well, eat up. You've got a long day ahead." School passed in a blur of unfinished assignments and half-heard lectures. Caleb's mind was elsewhere, spinning through possibilities and what-ifs. By lunchtime, he'd made up his mind. He couldn't just ignore the offer. Whether it was real or not, he had to know. He had to try. That afternoon, Caleb slipped out of school a little early, his heart pounding as he headed toward the address on the business card. It was a part of town he'd never been to, a place where the streets were cleaner, the sidewalks wider, and the buildings taller. The air felt different here, lighter somehow, as if the weight of life wasn't as crushing. Caleb stopped in front of a modest brick building, with a small sign reading Harlan and Associates. It wasn't flashy, but it looked professional enough. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, before pushing the door open. A bell above the door chimed softly. The reception area was small but tidy, with a few chairs and a desk where a middle-aged woman sat typing on a computer. She looked up, her expression polite but curious. "Can I help you?" she asked. Yeah," Caleb said, his voice faltering slightly. "I'm here to see Mr. Harlan. He, told me to come by." The woman smiled. "You must be Caleb. Mr. Harlan's expecting you. Go ahead. Down the hall, last door on the right." Caleb nodded, his stomach twisting with nerves as he made his way down the narrow hallway. The walls were lined with framed photographs, mostly of people Caleb didn't recognize. Some looked like employees, others like family. He stopped briefly in front of one picture, a younger Edward, standing beside a smiling boy who looked about Caleb's age. The boy's face was bright, full of life, but his eyes carried a shadow that Caleb recognized all too well. He forced himself to move on, stopping in front of the last door. He knocked lightly, his heart pounding. "Come in," Edward's voice called. Caleb pushed the door open, stepping into a small office. Edward sat behind a wooden desk, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Caleb," Edward said, standing and extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." Caleb shook his hand, trying to hide his nerves. "Thanks for having me." "Please, sit," Edward said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Caleb sat, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with a thoughtful expression. "You're probably wondering why I went out of my way to find you." "Yeah," Caleb admitted. "It's not exactly normal." Edward chuckled. "No, I suppose it's not. But you're not exactly a normal kid, Caleb. You stopped to help a stranger, even when you didn't have to. That tells me a lot about the kind of person you are." Caleb shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. "I guess I just couldn't walk away." "Exactly," Edward said, his tone growing serious. "That's rare. And it's why I think you'd be a perfect fit for what we do here." "And what is it that you do?" Caleb asked, his curiosity finally spilling over. "I mean, I've seen the card, But what does independent consultant even mean? Edward smiled faintly. It means we solve problems. Logistics, mainly. We work with businesses, small ones, mostly, to help them operate more efficiently. Deliveries, inventory management, operational support. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and it helps people. Caleb frowned, trying to piece it together. So, you're offering me a job doing that? Yes, Edward said. It's entry level, of course. You'll start with deliveries, shadowing one of our team members. But if you're willing to learn, there's room to grow. Caleb hesitated. It sounded good. Too good, almost. Why me? I don't have any experience. I don't even have a driver's license. Edward's smile widened. Experience can be taught. Character can't. And as for the license, most of our deliveries are done on foot or by bike. This isn't about qualifications, Caleb. It's about potential. And I see a lot of it in you. Caleb's stomach churned with a mix of hope and doubt. What's the catch? He asked finally. Because this feels, I don't know, too easy. Edward's expression softened. The only catch is that you have to want it. This isn't a handout, Caleb. It's an opportunity, and it's up to you whether or not you take it. Caleb looked down at his hands, his mind racing. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was a chance to do something real, something that might actually make a difference. But it also felt like a leap into the unknown, and that terrified him. Finally, he looked up, meeting Edward's gaze. Okay, he said, his voice steady. I'll do it. Edward's smile widened, a spark of pride in his eyes. Good. Welcome aboard, Caleb. By the time Caleb left the office, the sun was beginning to set, casting the streets in a warm golden glow. He clutched a folder of paperwork, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, like he was standing on the edge of something huge. When he got home, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, going through a stack of bills. She looked up as Caleb walked in, her brow furrowing when she saw the folder. "What's that?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, then set the folder on the table. "It's a job. I got hired." Linda blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to surprise. "A job? Where?" Caleb explained everything. The encounter with Edward, the offer, the job description. Linda listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he finished, she let out a long breath. "I don't know, Caleb," she said, her voice heavy with worry. "This sounds risky." "I know," Caleb admitted. "But Ma, we need this. You're working yourself to death, and Mia needs more than what we can give her right now. I have to try." Linda stared at him for a long moment, her eyes wet with unused tears. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, just be careful. Promise me." "I promise," Caleb said, his voice firm. As he sat down beside her, a flicker of hope stirred in his chest. For the first time in a long time, the locked doors in his life didn't seem quite so impossible to open. Stepping into the unknown, Caleb woke early the next morning, his nerves sharper than ever. The room was dim, the first gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains. He glanced at Mia, still fast asleep, her face peaceful as she clutched her favorite stuffed bear. For a moment, Caleb hesitated. He could stay in bed, ignore the folder of paperwork sitting on the kitchen table, and pretend none of this was happening. But then he thought of his mom's tired face, the stack of overdue bills, and the weight of responsibilities he'd been carrying for years. He didn't have the luxury of second-guessing himself. Slipping out of bed, Caleb dressed quietly, pulling on his only decent hoodie and a pair of worn sneakers. He paused in the kitchen, where Linda had left a note taped to the fridge. "Good luck, Caleb. Be careful. Love, Mom." The sight of her neat handwriting steadied him, and he folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket. By the time Caleb stepped out into the cool morning air, the sun was just beginning to rise. The city was waking up around him. The distant rumble of buses, the soft murmur of early commuters, and the occasional bark of a dog. The walk to Edward's office felt longer this time, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. When he arrived, the modest brick building looked the same as before, but this time it felt different, like a gateway to something bigger. Caleb pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell echoing in the quiet reception area. The same woman from before greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Caleb. Mr. Harlan is waiting for you in the conference room," she said, gesturing toward a door down the hall. Caleb nodded, his stomach twisting as he walked toward the door. He knocked lightly, and Edward's voice called out, "Come in." The conference room was small but tidy, with a long wooden table and a few mismatched chairs. Edward sat at the head of the table, a cup of coffee in hand, while another man, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes, stood by the window. The man looked up as Caleb entered, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," Edward said, rising to his feet with a smile. "Welcome back. I'd like you to meet someone. This is Marcus. He'll be showing you the ropes today." "Hey," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. Marcus nodded, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "You ready to get to work?" Caleb nodded, stepping fully into the room and taking a seat at the table. Edward slid a small packet of papers across to him. "This is just some formal onboarding. Basic policies, expectations, that sort of thing. Nothing too complicated." Caleb glanced over the papers, his eyes catching on phrases like confidentiality agreement and probationary period. It all felt a little overwhelming, but he signed where Edward indicated, trusting that the older man wouldn't lead him astray. Once the paperwork was done, Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Caleb, before we get started, I want to explain something. This job, it's not just about moving boxes or making deliveries. It's about being part of a team, a community. We help people, and we rely on each other to get the job done. Do you think you're ready for that?" Caleb swallowed hard but nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." Edward's smile widened. "Good. Marcus will take it from here." Marcus led Caleb down a narrow set of stairs to the storage area below the office. The room was cool and dimly lit, with rows of metal shelves stacked neatly with boxes. A faint hum filled the air, and Caleb noticed a small loading dock at the far end of the room. "First things first," Marcus said, handing Caleb a clipboard. "This is your inventory sheet. Every box in here is labeled with a code. Your job is to make sure the numbers on the sheet match what's on the shelves. Think you can handle that?" Caleb nodded, taking the clipboard. "Yeah, I think so." "Good," Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Start with aisle 3. I'll check in with you in a bit." Caleb made his way to the designated aisle, his nerves easing slightly as he fell into the rhythm of the work. The codes were simple enough to read, and as he checked each box against the inventory sheet, he found himself starting to relax. This wasn't so bad. It was quiet, straightforward, and for once, he didn't feel like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. But as he worked, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this job than met the eye. The storage room was immaculate, almost too pristine for what Edward had described as a small operation. And some of the boxes weren't labeled with typical product names. Instead, they had vague descriptors like specialty items or priority stock. "Everything okay?" Marcus's voice cut through Caleb's thoughts, and he turned to see the man standing at the end of the aisle, arms crossed. "Yeah," Caleb said quickly, holding up the clipboard. "Everything matches so far." "Good," Marcus said, walking over to stand beside him. He glanced at the boxes Caleb had been inspecting, his expression unreadable. "You're sharp. That's good. We need people who pay attention to details." "Thanks," Caleb said, unsure how to respond. Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Look, kid, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. This job isn't for everyone. It's hard work, and it's not always glamorous. But if you stick with it, there's room to grow. Edward doesn't give chances like this to just anyone. Don't waste it. Caleb nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and determination. I won't. By the end of the day, Caleb's body ached from hauling boxes and navigating the storage room, but there was a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in a long time. As he packed up to leave, Edward appeared in the doorway, his smile as warm as ever. How'd it go? Edward asked. Good, Caleb said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. It's a lot to take in, but I think I can handle it. I have no doubt you can, Edward said. He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. Here's your first day's pay. Consider it an advance on what's to come. Caleb hesitated before taking the envelope. He could feel the weight of the cash inside, and it made his stomach twist. Thanks, he said quietly. Edward placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, his gaze steady. You've got potential, Caleb. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, counting the money from the envelope. It was more than he'd ever made in a single day, enough to cover a week's worth of groceries, or knock a dent in the overdue electric bill. Linda watched him from across the table, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and worry. Are you sure this is all legit? She asked, her voice low. I think so, Caleb said. Edward seems different. I don't know how to explain it, but I think he really wants to help. Linda nodded slowly, her expression softening. Just be careful, okay? I trust you, Caleb. I know you'll make the right choices. As Caleb tucked the money into an envelope marked bills, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, it felt like the locked doors in his life were starting to crack open. But in the back of his mind, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that there were still pieces of the puzzle he hadn't seen yet. Cracks in the facade. Caleb's first week at Harlan and Associates passed in a blur of sweat, aching muscles, and a growing sense of purpose. The work was tough, hauling boxes, organizing inventory, and assisting Marcus with deliveries. But Caleb didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was contributing something real to his family. The money Edward paid him at the end of each day was more than Caleb had ever earned, and it went straight toward groceries and chipping away at their mounting bills. But even as Caleb settled into the job, small details gnawed at the edges of his mind. The company's operations, while professional, seemed oddly secretive. Some of the deliveries Caleb assisted with didn't make sense. Boxes marked priority stock went to nondescript warehouses or empty storefronts, and Marcus often dodged Caleb's questions with vague responses. On Friday evening, as Caleb sat in the break room drinking water, Marcus walked in, tossing his clipboard onto the table. Good work this week, kid, he said, leaning against the counter. You're catching on fast. Thanks, Caleb said, setting his cup down. He hesitated before speaking again. Hey, Marcus, can I ask you something? Marcus raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Shoot. These deliveries we're making, Caleb began cautiously. Some of the places we drop off at, they don't look like businesses. What's in the boxes? Marcus's expression shifted, his easygoing demeanor hardening slightly. We don't ask questions about the deliveries. Our job is to get the packages where they need to go, on time and intact. That's all you need to worry about. Caleb frowned, leaning back in his chair. But what if? Marcus cut him off, his tone firm. Look, Caleb, I get it. You're curious. But trust me when I say it's better not to know. Edward runs a clean operation, and he takes care of his people. That's all that matters. The conversation left a sour taste in Caleb's mouth, but he nodded, deciding to let it drop for now. He didn't want to push too hard and risk losing the job that had become a lifeline for his family. The next day, Caleb woke to the smell of pancakes. He rubbed his eyes, surprised to find that the small apartment felt lighter, less suffocating than usual. When he walked into the kitchen, Linda was flipping pancakes on the stove, and Mia was at the table, happily coloring in a new activity book. "Morning," Linda said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "You're up early for a Saturday." "Couldn't sleep," Caleb admitted, grabbing a plate. "What's all this?" Linda's smile widened. "A little celebration. Thanks to you. We've got the lights back on and groceries in the fridge. I figured we could use a nice breakfast." Caleb sat down, his chest swelling with pride. For once, it felt like he was making a real difference. Mia slid her activity book over to him, pointing at a half-finished drawing of a superhero. "Look, I made you," she said, grinning. The figure wore a hoodie and jeans, with a lightning bolt symbol drawn across the chest. Caleb laughed, ruffling her hair. "That's awesome. Squirt." The moment of peace didn't last long. As Caleb poured syrup over his pancakes, his phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, frowning when he saw Edward's name on the screen. "Hello." "Caleb. Good morning," Edward said, his tone unusually brisk. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, it's fine," Caleb said, standing and moving to the corner of the room for privacy. "What's up?" "We've got a situation," Edward said. "One of our regular couriers called out, and we need someone to cover a delivery. Can you come in?" Caleb hesitated, glancing back at his family. "Today? I mean, it's Saturday." "I know it's short notice," Edward said, his voice softening. "But I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. It'll be a quick job, and I'll make sure you're compensated for your time." Caleb sighed, weighing his options. The last thing he wanted was to disappoint Edward, or lose the trust he'd worked so hard to build. "Okay, I'll be there." "Thank you, Caleb," Edward said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll see you soon." The office was unusually quiet when Caleb arrived. The reception area was empty, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed in the stillness. Edward greeted him in the loading dock, where Marcus was already waiting beside a single large box. "Thanks for coming in," Edward said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "This delivery is a bit out of the ordinary, but I trust you to handle it." "What's in the box?" Caleb asked, eyeing the plain cardboard container. It was sealed tightly, with no labels or markings. Edward smiled faintly. "Just documents for one of our partners. Nothing to worry about." Marcus loaded the box onto a handcart, securing it with bungee cords. "You'll be taking this to 47th and Willow," he said. "It's an old office building, 3rd floor. Someone will be waiting for you." Caleb nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his mind. The address wasn't far, but something about the vague instructions made his stomach twist. Still, he didn't want to question Edward, not when he'd gone out of his way to give Caleb this opportunity. "Got it," Caleb said. "I'll get it there." "Good man," Edward said, his tone warm. "And Caleb, be careful." The walk to 47th and Willow was uneventful, the box rattling slightly on the handcart as Caleb navigated the uneven sidewalks. The neighborhood grew quieter as he approached the address, the bustling city sounds fading into an eerie stillness. The building was old, its brick facade weathered and cracked. The windows were dark, and the faded sign above the entrance read Willow Business Center. Caleb hesitated before pushing open the heavy glass door, the faint smell of mildew hitting him as he stepped inside. The lobby was empty, its linoleum floors scuffed and dull. The directory on the wall listed various businesses, most of which seemed to be defunct. Caleb spotted a single name next to Suite 304, EWH Holdings. Taking a deep breath, Caleb wheeled the handcart into the elevator. The ride up was slow, the ancient machinery groaning with effort. When the doors finally opened, Caleb stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. The air felt heavy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suite 304 was at the end of the hall. Caleb knocked lightly, his heart pounding. The door creaked open, revealing a man in a dark suit. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. "You're Caleb?" the man asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've got a delivery." The man stepped aside, motioning for Caleb to bring the box inside. The office was sparsely furnished, with a single desk and several filing cabinets lining the walls. Caleb set the box down, stepping back as the man inspected it. "Good," the man said after a moment. "That'll be all." Caleb nodded, eager to leave. But as he turned to go, he caught sight of something on the desk, a stack of photos, one of which showed Edward standing beside the man in the suit. In the photo, Edward's expression was different, harder, colder. Before Caleb could process what he'd seen, the man spoke again. "Tell Edward everything is in place." "Ah, sure," Caleb said, backing toward the door. "I'll let him know." The man's gaze followed Caleb as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. As Caleb made his way back to the office, his mind raced. The job had seemed simple enough, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in something much bigger and much darker than he'd realized. Shadows and doubts. Caleb's return to the office was quiet, his mind a whirl of questions and unease. The delivery should have been straightforward, a simple drop-off. But the interaction with the man in the suit and the glimpse of Edward in that strange photo made his stomach churn. When he arrived, Marcus was in the loading dock, rearranging boxes with a casual efficiency that Caleb couldn't hope to match yet. He looked up when Caleb entered, his usual sharp gaze softening slightly. "Back already?" "That was quick," Marcus said, setting down the clipboard he was holding. "Yeah," Caleb replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "No problems." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Good. You look like you've seen a ghost, though. Everything okay?" Caleb hesitated. He wanted to ask Marcus about the man in the suit, about the photograph, about why Edward's expression in it had seemed so different. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Marcus shutting down his earlier questions, or the nagging sense that the answers would only make things more complicated. "Yeah, just tired," Caleb said finally, forcing a smile. "Long week, I guess." Marcus nodded, though his sharp eyes lingered on Caleb for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "You'll get used to it. Go see Edward. He'll want to know you're back." Edward's office was warm and inviting, as always, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. The older man looked up from his desk as Caleb entered, his face breaking into a smile. "Caleb, good to see you. How did it go?" "Fine," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the churn of emotions beneath the surface. "The guy at the address said to tell you everything is in place." Edward's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief? Amusement? Caleb couldn't tell. "Excellent," Edward said, leaning back in his chair. "Thank you for stepping up on such short notice. I knew I could count on you." Caleb nodded, unsure how to respond. He wanted to ask about the man in the suit, about the strange atmosphere of the office building, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he shifted awkwardly, glancing around the room. "Something on your mind?" Edward asked, his tone gentle but probing. "No," Caleb said quickly. Too quickly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Edward nodded, his expression softening. "That's understandable. You've done well this week, Caleb. Better than I could have hoped. Why don't you take the weekend to rest? We'll pick things up on Monday." "Thanks," Caleb said, relieved to have an excuse to leave. "I'll see you Monday." As Caleb left the office, he felt Edward's gaze following him, warm and steady. But the moment Caleb turned the corner, that warmth vanished, replaced by the cold knot of doubt in his chest. That evening, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty envelope of cash in front of him. He had handed most of his earnings to Linda earlier, watching as the relief spread across her face. But even the sight of her easing tension couldn't shake the questions gnawing at him. Mia sat on the floor nearby, humming to herself as she built a tower out of old wooden blocks. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes curious. "What's wrong, Caleb?" "Nothing," Caleb said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." "You think too much," Maya said, wrinkling her nose. "Mom says you have worry wrinkles." Caleb laughed, though the sound felt hollow. "She's probably right." Mia grinned, going back to her tower, but Caleb's thoughts remained tangled. He glanced at the folded piece of paper in his pocket, the address of the office building where he'd made the delivery. The memory of the man in the suit, his cold eyes, and Edward's face in the photograph played on a loop in his mind. Finally, he stood, grabbing his hoodie. "I'll be back in a bit," he said, ruffling Mia's hair. "Where are you going?" she asked, her head tilting. "Just for a walk," Caleb replied. "Tell Mom if she gets back before I do." Mia nodded, her attention already back on her blocks. The streets were quiet as Caleb walked, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He had no real plan, but his feet carried him toward 47th and Willow almost on their own. The building loomed ahead, its facade even more foreboding in the dim light of the street lamps. Caleb hesitated at the entrance, his instincts screaming at him to turn around. But curiosity won out. He pushed the door open, stepping into the empty lobby. The smell of mildew was stronger now, the air heavy and stale. Caleb's footsteps echoed as he crossed the floor to the elevator, pressing the button for the 3rd floor. The ride up was slow, the elevator groaning with effort. When the doors slid open, the hallway was just as dim and unsettling as Caleb remembered. He made his way to suite 304, his heart pounding with every step. The door was slightly ajar. Caleb froze, his pulse quickening. He pushed the door open cautiously, peering inside. The office was empty, the desk cleared of papers, the filing cabinets open and bare. It was as if no one had ever been there. A faint click echoed behind him, and Caleb spun around to see the man in the suit standing at the end of the hallway, his expression cold. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice low and dangerous. I was just," Caleb stammered, his mind racing for an excuse. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, stepping closer. His presence was suffocating, his sharp eyes cutting into Caleb. "This isn't your concern." Caleb backed away, his hands trembling. I didn't mean to." "Leave," the man interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Now, Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the elevator, jamming the button repeatedly until the doors slid open. As the elevator descended, his heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What was Edward really involved in? And most importantly, what had Caleb gotten himself into? When Caleb returned home, the apartment was dark. Linda had come back from her shift and gone to bed, and Mia was fast asleep in their shared room. Caleb sank onto the couch, his hand shaking as he replayed the events of the night. He reached for his phone, staring at Edward's number in his contacts. He needed answers, real answers, but he wasn't sure if Edward would give them to him. And if he did, Caleb wasn't sure he wanted to hear them. Finally, he set the phone down, his thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and fear. The cracks in Edward's facade were growing, and Caleb couldn't ignore them any longer. Whatever was happening at Harlan and Associates, it was bigger and darker than he had realized, and he was right in the middle of it. But the worst part was the question he couldn't shake. Was Edward Harlan really the man he seemed to be, or was he something else entirely? Truth in shadows. The next morning, Caleb woke to the soft sound of rain tapping against the window. His chest felt heavy, weighed down by the events of the previous night. The encounter with the man in the suit replayed in his mind, his cold eyes and firm warning echoing like a threat. Caleb lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by stepping into Edward's world. By the time he dragged himself into the kitchen, Linda was already gone for her early shift. Mia sat at the table, her feet dangling as she munched on toast. She looked up and gave him a sleepy smile. "Morning, superhero." "Morning, squirt," Caleb replied, forcing a grin. He ruffled her hair before pouring himself a glass of water, the chill of the glass grounding him for a moment. He glanced at the clock. There were still a few hours before he was expected at work. Part of him wanted to skip entirely, but he couldn't. He needed the money, and more importantly, he needed answers. When Caleb arrived at Harlan and Associates, the office was buzzing with activity. Marcus and another worker were loading boxes into a van, their movements brisk and efficient. Edward stood near the loading dock, clipboard in hand, overseeing the operation. He looked up as Caleb approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Caleb." "Right on time," Edward said, setting the clipboard down. "How are you this morning?" "Fine," Caleb said, though his tone was strained. He shifted awkwardly, glancing at Marcus, who gave him a brief nod before turning back to his work. Edward's smile faltered slightly. "Something on your mind?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, can we talk?" "In private?" Edward studied him for a moment, his gaze steady. "Of course. Let's step into my office." Once inside the office, Edward closed the door and gestured for Caleb to sit. The room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. Caleb sat on the edge of his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "So," Edward began, leaning back in his chair, "what's troubling you?" Caleb took a deep breath, his thoughts tumbling over each other. "Last night, after I made the delivery, I went back to the building." Edward's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "The office was empty," Caleb continued, "like completely cleared out. And there was this guy, the one I gave the box to. He told me I shouldn't be there." Edward's expression didn't change, but Caleb thought he saw a flicker of something, concern, annoyance, cross the older man's face. "I see," Edward said finally, his tone calm. "And why did you go back?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Something didn't feel right. I wanted to understand what was going on." Edward sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "Caleb, I understand your curiosity. Truly, I do. But there are aspects of this business that aren't meant for everyone to know. Not because they're illegal or immoral, but because they're sensitive." "Sensitive how?" Caleb pressed. "I'm the one running around making deliveries. Don't I have a right to know what I'm getting involved in?" Edward's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "You're right. You do deserve some clarity." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Harlan and Associates works with a variety of clients, some of whom value their privacy above all else. The delivery you made last night was for one of those clients. The contents of the box, while important, weren't dangerous. They were documents, Caleb. Nothing more. "But the guy in the suit," Caleb began, but Edward held up a hand. "Was simply doing his job," Edward said firmly. "His demeanor may have been off-putting, but he had no intention of harming you. He was protecting his client's interests, as he's paid to do." Caleb frowned, still uneasy. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why all the secrecy?" Edward leaned back, his gaze steady. "Because the less you know, the safer you are. This line of work can be complicated, Caleb, but I would never put you in harm's way. You have my word on that." Caleb wanted to believe him. Edward's voice was calm, his demeanor reassuring, but the knot in Caleb's stomach refused to loosen. "So what now?" "Now," Edward said, standing and walking around the desk, "you continue doing what you've been doing. Showing up, working hard, and earning a better future for yourself and your family." He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You're a good kid, Caleb. Don't let doubt cloud your judgment. I see something in you, something rare. And I'm not the only one." The words sent a shiver down Caleb's spine, but he nodded. "Okay, I'll stick with it. Edward's smile returned, warm and genuine. That's all I ask. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Caleb threw himself into his work, trying to ignore the lingering doubts that clung to the edges of his thoughts. Marcus seemed to notice Caleb's unease but didn't comment, for which Caleb was grateful. By the time Caleb left the office that evening, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. He walked home slowly, the cool breeze brushing against his face as he replayed his conversation with Edward. "You're a good kid, Caleb. Don't let doubt cloud your judgment." The words felt like both reassurance and warning, and Caleb couldn't decide which one was stronger. When Caleb got home, the apartment was quiet. Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowing. "You're late," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Caleb said, setting his backpack down. "Just a long day." Linda studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, there's food in the fridge if you're hungry." "Thanks," Caleb said, though he didn't move toward the fridge. Instead, he sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table. Linda raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "Mom, what would you do if something felt off? Like, not bad, but not quite right either." Linda set her cup down, her gaze thoughtful. "Depends. Is it something you can walk away from?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I mean, this job, it's helping us. It's paying the bills, putting food on the table. But sometimes, it feels like there's more going on than I understand." Linda leaned forward, her expression serious. "Caleb, you're a smart boy. You've got good instincts. If something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. But don't throw away a good thing without thinking it through either." Caleb nodded, her words both comforting and frustrating. "Thanks, Mom." She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Trust yourself." That night, Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling as rain pattered softly against the window. He thought about Edward's words, about the man in the suit, about the strange, empty office. He thought about the bills still sitting on the counter and Mia's hopeful face when she called him a superhero. "Trust yourself." The words echoed in his mind as he drifted off to sleep, the knot in his stomach slowly easing. Whatever lay ahead, Caleb knew one thing. He couldn't afford to let fear or doubt hold him back. Not when so much was at stake. And yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows surrounding Edward Harlan were only growing darker, and that his choice to stay might pull him deeper into them than he was ready for.